He's very knowledgeable about economic policy of the United States, of course, and US history and the global situation. Today, he's going to be speaking on Gaza, Ukraine, China, and American isolationism. So I'm hoping that he will have some solution to the rampaging American imperialism that we see around the world that's causing so much trouble. And after his talk, we'll have questions for Jeff. So please, welcome to the Center for Global Justice. Thank you for coming.
It's still January, so I can wish everybody there a happy new year. It's an election year, as we all know, an election year in Mexico as well as the United States. But since my talk is on the theme that the United States ought to be minding its own business, I'm not going to talk about Mexico. I'm going to talk about what's going on in the U.S. Americans, of course, are looking forward to another triumph of democracy in November. We've got an aging Democrat who wants war with half the world against an aging psychotic Republican who wants one part of America to have war with the other part of America. This kind of reminds me of the old Woody Allen skit where the preacher gets in front of his congregation and says, on the one hand, brothers and sisters, we have complete disaster. On the other hand, we have absolute catastrophe. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose between. Now, by the way, I said aging. I'm older than both of these guys, so I don't want you to take that as a slur on old people. But for Americans, you know, the problem is not really Trump or Biden. The central problem here is that they are citizens of a global economy and a global empire, I mean, and both. And a global empire requires war. So today we are at war on at least 5 fronts. The Middle East in Gaza, the Ukraine. We are preparing for war with China. We're at war with a terrorist list that's so long and confused that I'd spend another hour trying to figure it out here with you. And we're in a civil war at home. So we've got imperial, the empire is moving domestically as well as internally. Niall Ferguson, who's a British historian and a supporter of American empire, once said that the great thing about the American empire is that Americans don't believe in it. Now, of course, you know, Americans hear that word empire and they think about Romans marching against other countries or British colonels exploiting Indians or Nazis. And so the same is true with most of the American media. But by any measure, the United States is a vast global empire. We have 750 military bases around the world, foreign bases. We dominate the 7 seas. We spend more money on our military than the next 10 big spender countries. We're the world's largest arms trafficker. And Democrats and Republicans agree that our foreign policy requires full spectrum dominance. Dominance. That's a word for empire. Now, it's not just the military. Think about this. At the height of the Roman Empire and the height of the Chinese Empire, the height of the British Empire, those countries had about 25 to 30% of the global GDP, the global economy. The United States, at its height, 2 decades ago, had 50% of the world's GDP. Now, to start to understand this, Of course, it's the news and the media. It's a complicated mush of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And I once had a conversation in Sarajevo with someone who was some official in this little Jewish museum in Sarajevo, and I asked him to explain to me at that time. This was several decades ago. To explain the conflicts in the Balkans. He said to me, everyone has a story. The Bosnians have a story, Serbs have a story, Croatians have a story, the Muslims have a story, we Jews have a story, and in each story, the storyteller is the good guy. Truth, he said, take your pick. Well, let's start with what our leaders tell us is our story. As good citizens, we should listen to what they're saying. Now, since the end of the Cold War, each president has had to produce a national security strategy for Americans who care and for members of Congress who mostly don't care. And those papers, those statements are sprinkled with the fairy dust of national interest. Bush used those words 24 times. Obama used those words 29 times. Trump used those words 67 times, and Biden used those words 53 times. And nowhere in those documents can you find an understandable rationale for what the national interest is. Now, Biden made a little bit of an attempt in his strategy paper. He said, well, the national interest is one, to protect the security of Americans. Well, that's good. It's an abstraction. Two, to make Americans prosper. And three, to project American values. Now, those words by itself doesn't tell you too much. So being a good citizen, we should ask our leaders exactly what they mean. And at the end of this, Biden says, these things, the national interest, means that the American role is enduring in the world, meaning the empire is forever. So let's take these arguments one by one. First, what we're doing in all these places is to protect Americans. From what? The strongest enemies we have, China, Russia, have no capacity to invade the United States of America. And no motivation, but if they had no capacity. The next tier of enemies, Iran, North Korea, Syria, are basket cases. Cuba is in the list of enemies. Is anybody in the United States frightened of an invasion by Cuba? And then when you go beyond that to the entire world, you see that it's full of religions, tribes, factions at each other's throats. None threaten the American homeland. Now, but you might say, what about 9/11? Now, George Bush explained 9/11 to us. He said they attacked us in New York in 9/11 and Pentagon because they hate us for our way of life. They hate us for our way of life. They hate our freedom of religion. They hate our freedom of speech. The way that they hate the nice way we treat women, But the evidence is that people around the world who hate America hate it not for what we do here, but what we do there. Osama bin Laden, the architect of the horrible attack on 9/11, said he did it because there were 40,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia. And remember, we were attacked not by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Every single member of that group was Saudi Arabia. US foreign policy has been a series of interventions in other people's neighborhoods in an attempt to tell them how they should live. In the Middle East, right now, as we have this lecture and discussion, we know there are people, because of what's happened in the last 6 months, who are plotting another 9/11. We don't know. I don't know who, I don't know when, but that's inevitable that they're doing that right now. The hatred is so intense. So the Pentagon, as a matter of fact, in its own papers, admits that the war on terror has produced more terrorists. So when you look at what President Biden says is our #1 reason for pursuing empire throughout the world, that American security, the last 6 presidents, not Biden or Trump alone or Bush, the last 6 presidents since the end of the Cold War have made Americans less secure. The second claim is that US foreign policy gives the average American prosperity. Now, that was a reasonable point, say 20 or 30 years after World War II. The US dominated the world economy. It made the dollar the world's basic currency. There are good jobs and profits and growth, and even social progress with the war on poverty and civil rights and things like Medicare. But all that ended in the mid-1970s. That is our ability to do that. Since the 1970s, others regained their markets. We had this era of mindless free trade to influence the rest of the world to join US alliances, which undercut labor, undercut manufacturing in the United States, and I would argue led to the presidency of Donald Trump. And then after the Cold War was over, after the Soviet Union, which was our enemy, disappeared, we kept diverting capital from the country's needs to rebuild the country to the military. The US share of the global economy is now 13%, a little below China and just a little above the European Union. So our empire has made us less competitive and more equal. Well, you might ask, why does it look so good out there? You know, like people are shopping at the shopping malls, and unemployment is down. The answer is we keep afloat by borrowing. It's the legacy of World War II, when we, as the triumphant nation, made the dollar the world's basic currency. That has allowed us to borrow. I don't want to go into the weeds with this, but I'll be happy to later. It has enabled us to borrow without having to pay back. So, for the last 45 years, we've run trade deficits with the rest of the world. That is, we have not been paying our way in international trade. The government, in 46 of the last 50 years, has run fiscal deficits. The rating of US bonds, of government bonds, has been downgraded by 3 of the world's big rating agencies. So we're borrowing to fund a bloated, corrupt, and inefficient military establishment. Costs us close to $1 trillion a year. Cannot be audited. It's too big for auditors to find out what's happening to the money. Still, it's not enough to support the imperial project. Today, at full capacity, the US arms industry cannot produce the weapons that we've promised to the Ukraine. For example, the Ukraine uses 200,000 artillery shells a month. The US can produce and deliver 15,000. it needs 500 tanks. NATO can't deliver 200. The, uh, the military, stretched as it is actually, is now shifted aid and concentration on U.S. military ambitions in the Middle East, to Israel's war against the Palestinians. Meanwhile, listen to this, with all this stuff going on, military experts, including people inside the Pentagon, say that if we had a war with China over Taiwan, in the Taiwan Straits, 1 week after the war began, we'd run out of long-range missiles. Now, I can save this for later, but you might ask, so what the hell are we doing with all this money? If we're taking on the world and we still can't provide. The last point about the claim that the empire makes Americans more prosperous is there's no prosperity in the future, as we know, without dealing with global warming. And to deal with it would take an unprecedented international cooperation. Now, understanding that, put that in your head, and then listen to Biden say, that we're going to drag Putin into international court. Somehow or other, we're going to march into the Kremlin and drag him into a trial at the international court, which is, by the way, a purview that we don't recognize. So, in any event, there is simply no way for us to deal with global warming while we consider China, Russia, and God knows how many other countries our enemy. One other point about the cost, it's estimated that dealing with the immigration flows in the United States would cost about $3 billion for New York City alone. Because the new budget, Biden's taking the money and sending it to the Middle East and to Ukraine, he has offered $1 billion for all American cities. I mean, this is just priorities up completely upside down, and perverse priorities on steroids. So much for bringing us prosperity. The third official definition of national interest is to project American values onto the world. What are those values? Peace, freedom, democracy, etc. Peace. During the Cold War, Americans were assured that the empire was necessary to protect us from the Soviet Union. Okay, 26 years before the Soviet Union fell, our government launched 46 military interventions in the Southern Hemisphere. All right, 26 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, we launched 46 military interventions. In the 26 years after the Cold War, after the Soviet Union had disappeared, we launched 188 military interventions in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, they're not on the front page of the New York Times. They're hardly on any page of any major newspaper or media source. So, words, story, and history have the same linguistic root. The empire's trends have cut off history. Michael Armitage was the Deputy Secretary of State at the time of 9/11. That afternoon, the Pakistani chief of Pakistani intelligence was in Washington, and he called and came over to see Armitage because he wanted to tell him about the Taliban. He wanted to explain to him what the history was, who these people were. Armitage just cut him off and said, history begins today. Well, if you believe that history begins today, you're going to miss an awful lot. And inevitably, 20 years later, 6,000 American lives lost, 236,000 Afghan lives lost. American payers put out $2.3 trillion on the Afghan war alone. Now, $2.3 trillion can buy you an awful lot of schools and hospitals and a lot of infrastructure to deal with global warming. The story of the Ukraine war leaves out history. We're told that we're in the Ukraine because of an attack by Russia, and Russia did attack the Ukraine. But if you start your story there, what you miss was the decades and decades of US pushing NATO, which is an anti-Russian organization, into Russia's face. Take a look at the map of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is a wedge into the geography of Russia. So we kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Warnings from people like George Kennan, who was the architect of US Cold War policy. I mean, an enormous number of people who, whether you like them or not, knew something about the situation, including Henry Kissinger, said, don't do this. What you're going to do is you're going to push Russia to the wall and it's going to react. And in the words of one international expert, you will ruin the Ukraine. That was said in 2015, and it was obviously true. Imagine this when you think about the Ukraine and Russia and the United States. Imagine what the American response would be if China announced its intention to have a military alliance with Mexico, putting Chinese soldiers, missiles, tanks on the border with California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I don't have to answer that for you because you know what the response would be. In the story, in the Middle East, the story, leaving out his story, it started with October 6th, the inexcusable attack by Hamas on the settlements in Israel. But this was provoked by decades of US support for Israel's ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and making Gaza a concentration camp. Now, without the United States support, Israel would not have done that because it didn't have the power. 20-year war with Iraq has virtually disappeared from our radar screens. Yet it was based on the lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The US invasion destabilized the Middle East, created widespread terrorism, which is still the core of our problem here. The war on terror, the list of people in Africa on the war on terror, our enemies, is ravaging that continent. Would there be conflicts in these places without America? Probably. But in every case, US intervention has made things worse. We say we need to stop terrorism because we have to enforce the rule of law on the world. But we don't even recognize the International Court. We've refused to sign the law of the sea. We've refused to sign treaties against chemical weapons and cluster bombing. As a matter of fact, we're a manufacturer of cluster bombs. And after making an agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons, we just tore it up. Trump tore it up. Biden swore he'd put it back together again. Biden didn't. We're preparing war with China over Taiwan. Interestingly enough, there was a stable situation going on between the United States and China. Nixon and Kissinger, back in the late 1960s, made a deal. And it was the US would recognize Taiwan as part of China, which it has been historically. And China agreed not to push that claim. It worked for 50 years. Now, you're talking to somebody who's hardly a fan of Nixon or Kissinger, but it worked for 50 years. Trump and Biden broke that deal. Biden sent Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, demanding independence for that island from China. The U.S. Navy patrols the southeast, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. But China is no threat to the passage of goods and services. China depends on trade. Well, you might say, surely foreign aid helps. We've done some good things. And yes, we built a few hospitals, schools, water systems. But you don't need $1 trillion a year military to build a few hospitals and schools. Think, Bush claimed that bringing women's rights to Afghan, that he was bringing women's rights to Afghanistan with bombs that murder women and children every day. U.S. occupation tolerated rape and vastly increased narcotic production. So just summarizing all three definitions of our leaders of national security and national interest: security from invasion and attack, economics, the morality of world leadership, all of that failed. Joe Biden said after the Ukraine issue started, quote, "We stand up to bullies. That's who we are. That's who Americans are." Well, sorry to differ, Mr. President, but we tolerate bullies and war because we don't have to sacrifice. The last serious anti-war movement was in Vietnam. Nixon eliminated the draft. Reagan showed conservatives that they could borrow money to finance military spending and never have to pay it back. With those two things, eliminating the threat of taking your children away with the draft and eliminating the need to pay taxes for war, Americans couldn't care less. Now, they say, what they say in surveys is a result of them being able to support war from their couches. They don't stand up to bullies. They sit back on their couch watching war as entertainment. Politicians and pundits and bureaucrats constantly insist that we are, quote, good guys, and anyone in our way are bad guys. It's foreign policy by comic strip. It's not just foreign policy or foreign policy. The same mentality that says we can tell other people how to live is linked to the mentality that says some Americans have the right to tell other Americans what they can read, who they can love, what women can do and what can't do with their own bodies. Listen to the language of MAGA, for example. Quote, "America is under attack." It's the same kind of paranoia that we apply to foreign policy. Meanwhile, we're stumbling towards World War III, left with little more at the moment than Woody Allen's witty prayer, but it's not so funny. So it's time for some radical rethinking of the U.S. role in the world. And now I'm addressing this especially to liberals and progressives, where internationalism has been an article of faith. But the more you dig down, it turns out internationalism has been a cover for naked imperialism and the fabricated paranoia that feeds it. The word isolationism is practically banned from political discussion in the United States. It's a pejorative. It stops conversation, conjures up head in the sand reactionary right-wingers. In much of the press, Donald Trump is labeled an isolationist. A complete misunderstanding what this guy is about. When he became president, he had 144 businesses in 26 countries. His foreign policy was little more than a protection racket for his sleazy overseas business schemes. If you look at who's loudest in the Congress for more military spending, it's Trumpist Republicans. It also misunderstands American history. The first 150 years of the American Republic's experience is considered an isolationist period. Well, we traded with other countries. We interacted. People traveled here and went there. We were open up to immigration. We built the country on immigration. We were hardly what you consider the traditional way of isolationism. Now, we shouldn't romanticize the past. We took half of Mexico in those days and imposed genocide on Native Americans. But as far as foreign policy goes, we've obeyed John Quincy Adams' advice. Do not roam the world seeking monsters to destroy. We need some humility here. We are not indispensable. And conservatives and liberals think we are. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State to Bill Clinton, said, well, we're indispensable. We're the indispensable country because we Americans, quote, stand taller. We see further, unquote. But the empire has failed because we don't see the way. Therefore, we don't understand it. Massive military intelligence system that costs trillions of dollars has been wrong on Vietnam, wrong on Somalia, wrong on the Balkans, wrong on the Soviet Union's collapse, wrong on Libya, wrong on Afghanistan, wrong on Iraq, wrong on Ukraine, wrong on Gaza, and the list goes on and on. So you just stand back and say, well, the empire, but why are we losing all these wars? And that was finally someone in the press, the only one I can find, asked a Pentagon general, well, if you're spending all this money and you're making this huge effort and we're so important in the world, why is it that we keep losing every war that we're in? And we haven't really won a real war since World War II. And it's interesting, the Pentagon general's response to this question, why, if we're so great, why are we losing these wars? The Pentagon general said, the issue is not, the goal is not to win or lose. The goal, I'm quoting him, the goal is to stay in the game. Now, what the hell does that mean? Lives destroyed, terrible costs of war that we've seen, to what? Stay in the game? What is he talking about? He's talking about the empire. We must dominate. So this is the game for which we are slowly, and then it's going to come faster and faster, going down the tube. This is comic strip foreign policy. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And yet, when you start scratching at it, it's driven for lust for power and wealth that blinds our leadership of both parties from reality. All right, let me skip. What would we do here? I've used this term progressive isolationism. And what does that mean? Simply, it means, first, getting out of other people's business. In the Ukraine, tell Zelensky to make the deal the French and the Germans proposed 2 years ago. And that was simple. Russia agrees to let the Ukraine develop in its own way. And Ukraine agrees to keep out NATO and stop suppressing the Russian majority in East Ukraine. There were people and people who know more about this than I do say that Putin was ready for it. But the United States stopped it. There's no question about that. Look that up. Biden and sent Boris Johnson, who was at that time Prime Minister of England, to tell the French and the Germans, no, We don't want any deal with Russia. Get out of Ukraine. Get out of the Middle East. We don't need the oil anymore, which they told us we needed, and that's why we had to get into all these wars. And Israel doesn't need us to defend it. It is by far the strongest military force in the Middle East. It's got nuclear weapons. Nobody's going to invade Israel. But with us, Israel has kept moving and expanding and gone through this terrible process of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and turned Gaza into a concentration camp. Without us, Israel would have a choice. Either continue what they're doing now, and which is not working, or they'd be forced to deal with the Palestinians and Arab neighbors. That's a shock. Oh my God, we couldn't possibly blah, blah, blah. So it's their problem, not ours. We need to back off from threatening China. Like it or not, China will be dominant. It will be the dominant power in East Asia. Like it or not. Oh, but they're bad guys. Well, bad guys or good guys. They're going to be the dominant power. Just as we are the dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America. And stop the destructive meddling in Africa and other places in Asia, the Pacific, South America. This is somebody else's neighborhood. We got enough issues here in the United States to deal with that we don't need to go around the world, as John Quincy Adams warned us against, in search of monsters to destroy. We need to get beyond Woody Allen's funny but depressing prayer, depressing disaster on one hand, catastrophe on the other, with a better prayer. The old children's prayer, I guess it's a children's prayer, I don't know. It says, grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That is not a bad set of principles for foreign policy. Things we cannot change, we should not try to change. And there are things we could change. Humanitarian aid without strings, for example. Organizing the world to stop global warming. Stop supplying the world with guns and cluster bombs. Spend the resources and energy on our own neighborhood, not just the United States, but we have neighbors, Mexicans and Canadians and Central Americans. We need a regional plan here for economic and social development in a region that is falling apart. So we can still be good world citizens without arrogantly assuming the role of the world's policeman and savior. And finally, pay attention to history. History comes obviously from the words story. And listening to history, listening to the other person's story, not necessarily agree with it, but understanding what that story is and why they believe it is essential if we're going to avoid further catastrophe in the world. 100 years after 9/11, 100 years before 9/11, Armitage, the Assistant Secretary of State's ignorant words. Before that, the Spanish philosopher George Santayana wrote, quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Quote. And we seem to be repeating it time after time. And I will stop there. Thank you for your time. I hope it was worth it. Hello. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good,
Yeah, you're clear.
good. Well, I'm not in the room. I'm on Zoom, and just like you.
Where I am.
So Pardon?
I said, I'm not sure where I am, but go ahead.
Well, I don't have any idea where you are, but I heard 90% of what you had to say, and I agreed with pretty much 100% of it. My question is, as a person, for you, is as a person that when I was living in the United States, which I am not, I was involved in trying to start a second party or a third political party and nothing really came out of it. A little bit of Ralph Nader, and that was about it. So my question to you is, you have a very poignant and meaningful message. How do you get it out to Americans?
Um, I don't know how to do it successfully. All I know how to do is keep talking, and to the extent I have the energy, keep talking and keep writing. But my best answer to that question is that uh, the progressive side of of our politics, where it's got to come from, it's not going to come from the other side. The progressive side needs to understand that we're in a different situation than we were 2 decades ago, and uh, uh, present its analysis and its understanding and its solutions to foreign policy, not primarily because it helps other people in the world. This is, despite how you feel, it's only going to stop if Americans understand how it's hurting them. It's going to stop when Americans understand how the money that they could use to deal with the huge social problems. I mean, as I said, we've got a civil war coming up here in the United States. The money that we could use for that is just being siphoned away into other people's pockets and to a lunatic conflicts in various parts of the world. So it seems to me that the argument can only win in the United States, probably two other places too, if uh, it's not, oh, we should stop doing bad things to other people. I mean, I've been trying to make that argument for all my life. And as I said, I'm older than Biden and Trump. But Americans don't care about that. I mean, they might a little bit say, "Oh, it's terrible what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in Guatemala, for example, in Central America." But they don't. They don't really care about it. So the argument has to be made, not that we're going around, not that the problem is what we're doing to other people, but the argument has to be made, I think, in a more straightforward and, if you will, selfish way. What we're doing to ourselves. What is it that we're doing to ourselves when we go around the world looking for monsters to destroy and defining monsterism as anybody we don't happen to like that week?